So this is part 2 of the threading jig video, and we're actually going to make a thread. I'm just going to use these prepared bits of wood. I'm not going to make a finished box, but just show you how to actually make a wooden thread. Now, normally elm you wouldn't be able to hand thread chase it, or it would be very difficult to because of the grain structure, and that's one really good advantage of the Hope Easy Set threading jig, is that you can cut threads in all different types of timber. So what I like to do when I'm making any threaded box or lid or project is to do the internal thread first, and I find it easier that way to then sort of match up the male thread to the female thread. So our bit of wood's mounted, we'll just hollow some of the inside out and do some preparation ready to actually cut the thread. I'm just going to use the spindle gouge just to true the front. And we'll start to hollow that out. Again, I'm just going to use the spindle gouge. And then what we need to do is actually make this edge parallel. If it's not parallel, then the threads aren't going to work properly. So I like to use my detail tool to make a nice parallel edge. And I'm going to use the round tool mounted in the detail tool. And what this does is cut a nice parallel edge. Now I like to sort of line it up with the bed bars. So I've done the initial cut, and then we'll just do a finishing cut. Line it up with the bed to make sure that it's nice and parallel. A nice little chamfer here, and we're ready for the next process. So in order to actually harden the wood and prep it for the thread cutting, I find that it's much better if you just use some thin cyanacrylate glue just to sort of soak in and harden that timber. So I like to use thin because it really soaks into the timber, and just nice and gently just run a little bit round on the edge there, not too much, and then I just use a bit of tissue just to quickly wipe that on the inside edge. I then like to activate it so it goes off very quickly. Don't use too much activator, just enough. Wipe the surface, and that's ready for the thread cutting. So how it actually works is we're going to keep that piece of wood in the chuck, take that off and actually mount it on the threading jig. So I'll just go ahead and set it up, and then we can talk about the process when we're actually cutting the thread. The threading jig goes into the banjo, and then we need to set it at the correct height. So I use the towel stock to line up with a hole at the back. And I adjust this collar so that when we've lined it up with the towel stock at the back, like so, we can then set that, and the jig will go to the correct position each time. So what happens is the piece of work threads onto the front, and basically how the system works is whatever thread you have here, this is the 16 TPI, which is the standard thread, it's going to replicate that thread on there when we introduce it into the cutter. The basic set comes with just the cutter, and you can mount that into Jacob's chuck or pin jaws, or you can buy a cutter holder which is threaded and just very simply goes on the spindle like so. So now we're almost ready to start cutting our first thread. We need to get it into position, so we'll just talk about that. And the first thing that you need to do is just give yourself some space here at the front. You don't want it wound all the way back, you need sort of a finger's gap here, and also the gap here. Now into this threading jig is a click system. So you know how far to advance or retract on this plane, and that determines how deep you take the cutter to the correct depth of the thread cut. So that's very important that we know how far in and out we're actually moving that position. So I'll give myself a small gap here, so it's not fully closed and it's not fully open. And then we're just going to slide that into position with the cutter. You can do it either side, but I find it easier to do it on that side because you can see what's happening. And once it's touching just on the inside, we then need to line that up so that it's parallel with the bed bars. Now I do that by eye on the chuck to begin with, so we just get it very, very close, and then I'll just use a steel ruler and rest it on there just to double check that we are parallel with the bed bars. I'll show you that now. I'll just get a steel rule. So steel rule, if you rest it onto your chuck, you can actually look down and very, very accurately you could see whether or not that's parallel. It just needs to come back just a little bit. Yeah, and now we're spot on. So what we can do is just make sure everything's locked in, and then we can advance that forward so the cutter's away from the piece of wood, and we can turn that back so that it's free when we actually start the lathe up. So with that now spinning, we need to advance it so it's just touching the surface.
How fast is the lathe for you?
By the way, I like to run the cutter as fast as the lathe can go, so 3,000, 3,500, and then it cuts better. So what we need to do is advance this until it just touches the surface of the piece of wood. At the moment it's not touching. So what I like to do is just move that back until I just start to hear that it's touching the wood. Yeah, okay. So that is the zero position because it's just touching the surface. In the instruction book, there's different settings for different TPIs. So this is the 16 TPI, and it needs 5 clicks to go to the correct depth. So what I'd like to do is do 4. So we release the handle, 1, 2, 3, 4. And we can make our initial cut. And just slowly advance the wood into the cutter. We normally go about 10mm down, but you want to stop before the cutter hits the base, and then we can just slowly come back out. And we can use the hinge plate to actually stop and check our threads. So we release this pin on the side, that hinges back out the way, that will actually locate back in for safety, it won't drop down, but we can actually look at the threads, check how deep we've gone, and what I like to do is just add a little bit more super glue in there just to strengthen those before we do the final cut. Remember, it's 5 clicks for 16 TPI, we've done 4, we've got 1 more to go to clean everything up. But I'm just going to add some super glue into that first. Just a small drop into the threads and just move it round so the glue will actually just trickle along. And what that does is just soak into the wood and just harden everything up. So when we do our finishing cut, beneath the surface it's still nice and strong. Perfect. So just a quick wipe of the tissue, quick activation, like so. Make sure you advance that back. We can now drop it into the same position, and because of the accuracy of the machine, it's actually going to stay in exactly the same position, so you're just going to cut a bit deeper. So one more click to do our finishing cut. I like to just support the piece of work, and we just advance that forward and do our final cut. Just slowly retract that out. And hopefully you can see from the video how clean and how well we've actually made our first thread. So now that's done, we have to make the male thread. So I'll just take that apart, like so. Mount the next piece of wood up, and we'll show you how to do the male thread. So again, I always like to start by just cleaning the face of that piece of timber. Just use a spindle gouge. So we need to do some measuring, and I'm going to use some metal verniers to do that. This is the one part that you have to be fairly accurate at getting the next part done. It's quite easy to do. With practice it becomes easier. So we'll just talk through the process and hopefully you can see for yourself. So we need to work out the offset. If I'd made the piece of wood just to fit exactly in there, obviously it's just going to fall in. So we need to make that bigger, cut the thread so the two parts actually meet together. And for 16 TPI, in the instructions you'll see that the offset for 16 TPI is 1.1 millimetre. So how we do that is just use some verniers, just wobble across the diameter, make sure you've got the full diameter, and then just press 0, okay? Once you've done that, all you need to do is just go 1.1 millimetre, so just advance that, 1.1 or thereabouts, 1.11, that's fine, and we can use that as a measurement on there. Now, I like to spin the lathe up and mark with the left tip. The right tip must never touch the wood because that can flick up, but it's a very quick and accurate way of transferring sizes. So point slightly downhill, I just mark the wood with the left tip and move it in until they meet up, but as I say, the rights must never touch the wood. Okay, so you can see the size there. And we just use the parting tool. And I normally do sort of 1.5 of the parting tool. I like to put a chamfer on the front. And it's very important on this one that you actually cut a groove at the back. So I use the thin parting tool just to cut a small 2mm step, and then we can stop and check our size. So it's just a little bit tight, just a little bit more to come off. Just a tiny bit more. Perfect. So if we go back to the super glue, just to harden that up, So just run a bit along the top with the tissue, activate, wipe it again, and then we can get that mounted the same way as we've done the female. So onto the threading jig. Remember to have our gap here and our small gap here of about 3 or 4 millimetre. Now this one we're going to line up pretty much the same way, so we're just going to get that on the edge of the wood, look down here with the bed bars, use a steel rule, and we can just line that down with the bed bars to make sure that we're parallel. Yep, we got exactly where we need to be. And then we can move everything back out the way so that we can spin that up and find the kiss test, which is just touching the surface. So at the moment it's not touching. So I just advance it sort of one at a time. Yeah, and I could just hear that it's just touching the surface. So that's 0. We need 5 clicks because it's 16 TPI. We're going to do 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Run the speed up, 3000 RPM, something like that. And nice and gently, we're just going to advance forwards. And the cutter's going to drop into that groove that we've cut at the back. Okay? So we can stop there, release the hinge back, and check our fit. Now it shouldn't actually fit yet because we've got one more click, but it should start to sort of go on and feel a bit tight. Yeah? It's just going on, but it's tight. It's not going to go all the way on. But we've got one more click to go. But I like to stop, just add a little bit more thin glue, very, very gently. Just run that into the threads. You don't have to do this on all timbers, you know, but when you've got very open grain structure like elm or oak or ash, it just helps to keep it strong and make it work. So we'll just take that back, lower it down into position. One more click, and we'll cut our thread. Okay, let's see if it fits. Still a little bit too tight. Now that's okay. I'd like to show you the next stage is how we address that. It was just slightly too big. We need one more click. But what I'd like to do is just use some abrasive, and we just take some tips off and then do one more click, and we should be at the right size. So I just use some 240 grit, something like that, and all we're going to do is just run on the surface just to take the tips down. I like to run just a little bit more glue into the threads. We've activated it. One more click, and we'll just run that through again. Perfect. Now, what I like to do is just add a little bit of wax to that. This is just beeswax and liquid paraffin, but you can use ordinary finishing wax. It just lubricates the thread. And what I like to generally say is that the thread should be loose. If you have to really tighten that, then the wood will move and tomorrow you won't be able to open it. So it should run freely and should spin. And if it does that, it's a good thread and it's going to stay that forevermore. So the next thing is to line the grain up, which is a bit more difficult, but I'll just quickly show you that. So we've made our first thread. Really pleased with that. Hope you can see how easy it is to cut threads. Please carry on watching on the next section and we're going to do some extra tips and tricks on how to use it. So the next thing people like to know is actually matching the grain up, which can be, seem to be quite difficult, but actually it's fairly easy. You just need a little bit of patience. So if we thread that on, the grain should match up here, but actually it moves round to here. So this part needs to go round to there, okay, which is about a third. In order to do that, you need to mount the female section up, and we need to just take some off the surface so it moves round a bit more each time you take some off the surface. The trouble is if you take it off this surface, then the gap gets bigger, and if this thread's very small, it can actually fall through, okay, the threads. So you have to take it off this part. Now, I just like to use my detail tool, but you can use a skew on the side, something like that. And very, very gently, we're just going to take a small amount off that face. What I like to do is just put a small chamfer back on the inside edge. And we'll just see where that's gone to. So before it was around about here, but now we're actually getting closer. I'll just put a pencil line on there just so you can see how much it moves each time you take that small amount off. So I say you need patience because it's best just to do just a small bit at a time until you actually get it round to where the grain is lined up. So there is where we had it before with the pencil line. That's where we have it now. So that small amount, you can see how much generally it sort of advances by taking that small amount off. So we probably need sort of similar amount again, if not just a little bit more. So that we were there, now we're there. You can see we're getting much closer. Okay, very close now. I would say this should be the last one. Now, generally, we're very, very close. Now, I would personally leave it there because tomorrow, when the wood has cooled down, because we've been working on it, I would say we're going to be pretty much there. But just for the purpose of the video, we'll just take one more swipe off the surface. And there we have it, the grain perfectly aligned, but I always stop before that because, as I say, probably tomorrow when the wood's cooled down, that might actually be beyond that point. And that's how we match the grain up. So the first trick was to match the grain up. We'll show you how to do that. Another tip is to use the wax. We've talked about that. In general operation, I generally sort of say that you should support the wood. That's very important. When you're actually advancing this forwards, you can maybe get some fishtail. Everything's really accurately made, so it's not through the jig, it's just natural movement of fishtailing. But if you support with your hand as you're advancing forwards, you can maintain a nice steady cut and you'll get a much better cut on the threads. The other tip I want to talk about, under here is a nylon spacer, and that keeps some pressure on the spindle and stops any movement. Now, you'll notice just a small movement here. It just wears down with time, and it just needs tightening up. So every couple of months, something like that, depending on how much you use it. It's very easy to do. We just need to release that nut, maybe just go quarter of a turn, retighten the nut, and you can see that's taken out and put a little bit of resistance on that. So everything just tightens down and makes it more accurate for cutting the threads. So please carry on watching further videos that we have on actually making projects. We're going to make some more difficult threading items, but I hope you've enjoyed watching this video on the introduction of the Hope Easy Set threading jig. Thanks for watching.